Good morning, Marjolijn.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here with us to talk about readiness, crisis readiness versus crisis management.
It's a pleasure.
We have heard recently about many crises happening, like the Nissan, Renault, Uber, United Airlines, Facebook, and you name it. Now, you have been working with boards into this crisis management. So can you share your experience with us, please?
Crisis is a very unwelcoming event for an organization, but it can be a downright nightmare for a board. Because a board by nature has distance to the organization, its people, its information. And from that perspective, it is difficult for a board to oversee an organization, even in a normal situation, but it gets even very hard in a crisis situation. Yet by nature, they have the role to oversee that an organization sails through that storm with the least possible damage, no casualties, and preferably some lessons learned. I assist the board to navigate the organization through the storm, and I work with the board, with the executives, and over the years I've been involved in hundreds of crisis situations.
Right, and I would imagine that in such situation, which is a storm, you call it actually, is that the boards are really put under pressure.
Yes, you obviously see a lot of pressure, you see a lot of emotion. There is anxiety, there is fear, there is stress, there is time pressure, which adds to all these emotions. There's a lot of insecurity. And these emotions are also facts to the crisis you really need to deal with.
What do you see the top pressures, or if we can call them the watch-out crisis today, especially that we see there is more of geopolitical shifts, there is a lot of activism, there is climate change, scrutiny from regulators, and much more. So what do you see, if we can call them the trends in crisis?
The main distinction you can make is that crisis can come from external sources, that is basically the list you've just mentioned, and crisis can also come from internal sources. So crises that come from internal sources very often have to do with safety regulations which have not been met, governance failures, operational accidents, these kind of situations. External situations come from societal outrage, which are very often called PR or reputational crisis, but they obviously have a source which is non-PR or reputational related. Economic situations, climate change, political changes.
And when should board of directors take the lead in dealing with such corporate crises?
Boards can either take a leading role or they can take a supportive role. So when does a board take a leading role? That happens when the performance of the executives is at the heart of the crisis. So these are most of the time internal originated crisis situations like fraud, like a really big conflict between employees and the executives, malpractice by the executives, situations when a board really should step in and take the lead. They should take the tactical decisions. In any other situation, the board should remain in their supportive overseeing governance role, and they should be available to the executive to probe, ask questions, challenge the executive.
And what do you see the typical errors, or if we can call them pitfalls, that corporate make today when dealing with crisis, and what role the board should be playing in these?
Boards very regularly forget to make this formal decision, are we in a leading role or are we in a supportive overseeing role? If they don't do that, what you very often see in a crisis situation is that they mix up those roles. So they step from a supervisory role to a very tactical role and back and forth. Another thing which you see happening is that, well, a board goes into action mode. That is a board who needs to be overseeing. They step into action, which is not a good thing. Thirdly, what you see is that in a crisis situation, you always need to make a risk-benefit analysis, right? If you only look at risk-benefits, you can lose the strategy out of sight, and you become too operational and too tactical. If you want to bring strategy into the discussion, it is very good to question yourselves on to whom do we owe a duty of care. And if you ask any board under normal situations, to whom do we owe a duty of care, the answer is always to the customer.
You mentioned in your study that having a crisis readiness plan is actually more important than a crisis management. So can you tell us about the difference between both and why so that the crisis readiness is more important?
Yes, crisis management is actually one element of crisis readiness. And I'd rather talk about crisis readiness because if you do crisis readiness well, you will decrease the likelihood and the impact of any crisis that will occur. So it's a more proactive approach as opposed to crisis management, which is a more reactive approach. Crisis readiness contains all 4 phases of a crisis. So the first phase would be prevention of the crisis. The second one would be to prepare the crisis. The third one is crisis management, is to control the crisis when it does occur. And the fourth one is to evaluate post-event. So in crisis prevention, in the first phase of crisis readiness, what you need to focus on is to question yourself if you have a crisis-fit culture. In a crisis-fit culture for an organization that encourages entrepreneurship means that it has to be able to shift to a more military approach in order to handle the crisis well. Secondly, what you need to do in prevention is you need to define your risk appetite. You need to make sure you have mature incident response processes. If you do not have these in place, a crisis will, at best be managed well because of coincidences and lots of luck, but not because you have been preventing it. So then if you start preparing a crisis, you need to go into scenario planning. You need to train. The board should be part of the training. A board should, I think, at least once a year be part of crisis preparation trainings. The board should also oversee that the company has a heat map. And in the heat map, you can see the risk. The third situation and the third phase is crisis management. That is when the crisis does occur. So in that phase, it is important to really use these processes. I always compare it to air traffic controllers. They have procedures in place which they need to follow under normal situations. When a crisis occurs, they have to rely on their crisis protocols and processes. They have to follow those. If these processes are inadequate, then they start improvising. But you shouldn't be doing that. You should rely on the protocols and the processes you have been developing while preparing. So that's important in the third phase. The fourth phase is crisis evaluation. So that's the post-event evaluation. There's always a lesson in a crisis. The board should oversee that the organization is doing this evaluation, and the board should get the extracts of the evaluation.
Now, my final question to you, which is going back to a real case that is hot in the press these days, which is about Carlos Ghosn, the Nissan-Renault crisis. This is really from your personal perspective. You know, what are your thoughts, and actually, where is the board in all of this?
Yes, so let me start by saying that it is always very difficult to judge a situation where we can only rely on public sources and we have no insider knowledge. So it is very difficult to make a solid assessment. So what we can do is evaluate the facts we know from public sources. What we know from public sources is that the CEO, Carlos Ghosn, had celebrity status. As a board, this is a big red flag. It brings hubris into the boardroom. It brings the Icarus syndrome into the boardroom. A CEO with celebrity status is above the law. He is not open-minded anymore to learning anything because knows it all. This is dangerous. And a board should be aware of that. I prefer modesty in the boardroom. With modesty in the boardroom, you can handle everything. With Icarus in the boardroom, you will always fly too close to the sun and then you will drop, right?
Yes.
So this is what happened. Given that the judge has not ruled yet, so we don't know yet if he did cross any formal lines. Nevertheless, we can say that there is a troublesome situation. A very big crisis, really. So the first thing is Goon being the man he is with the celebrity status he had. The board should have been critical on that. On the other side, what you see is that the structure the company had was both too complex and too simple. So it was actually a simple model where both companies held stake in each other. It is probably very difficult for lawyers to write it down in the right way. So we have two boards of directors, not one. And with two non-executive boards, in a crisis situation like this, immediately the duty of care question comes at the table. To whom do we owe a duty of care? Investigative journalists have suggested that it is due to the exceeding expectations of Nissan at the moment that this crisis is occurring at this moment because Nissan wants a bigger stake and wants to have more to say in the whole structure. So that's a governance issue. Also a governance issue is that there was no CEO succession planning. Both boards started to plan the succession of Goon while he was jailed in separate ways. Then, thirdly, what they did is they started debating this whole situation in the press, those two boards. That is not a wise thing to do. So these are all telltales of governance that needs improving. And that is obviously what the challenge is at the moment.
Yeah, so in a way, it's just like as if this crisis had to burst at some point or the other. And
you can say that they were heading towards disaster, yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Marjolijn, for your insights.
Yes.
Very helpful. Thank you for being here with us.
You are very welcome. It was a pleasure.